In 1945, the world fell into an uneasy silence. The war that had consumed entire continents was finally over, but peace did not bring relief. It brought emptiness. Cities across Europe and Asia were reduced to rubble, millions were dead, economies were shattered, and the old global powers that once ruled the world were exhausted beyond recovery. Empires that had dominated history for centuries collapsed in a matter of years, leaving behind a power vacuum unlike anything the world had ever seen. Amid this devastation, one nation stood apart from the ruins. The United States of America emerged from World War II not only victorious, but stronger than at any point in its history. While Europe burned and Asia suffered unimaginable destruction, the American homeland remained untouched. Its factories were intact, its infrastructure modernized, and its economy was accelerating at a pace no other nation could match. The war had transformed the United States into the greatest industrial power on Earth, responsible for more than half of global manufacturing output. This was not merely recovery, it was absolute dominance. The United States also possessed something no other nation had: nuclear weapons. The atomic bomb was not just a military breakthrough, it was a psychological one. With the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the United States demonstrated a level of power that instantly redefined warfare. The message was unmistakable. A single nation now held the ability to end wars in moments. From that point forward, global politics revolved around American capability and American decisions. As the war ended, Europe faced an impossible challenge. Entire economies had collapsed, currencies were worthless, food shortages were widespread, and political instability threatened to tear nations apart. In this moment of desperation, the United States stepped in with what appeared to be an act of generosity. The Marshall Plan promised massive economic aid to rebuild Europe. Billions of dollars flowed across the Atlantic, restoring infrastructure, stabilizing governments, and restarting industrial production. But this was not charity, it was strategy. By rebuilding Europe under American financial guidance, the United States ensured that the continent would rise aligned with American interests. Markets were opened, capitalism was reinforced, and political systems became economically dependent on American stability. Europe recovered, but it did so within a framework designed in Washington. Control was no longer enforced through occupation or conquest, but through prosperity and dependency. This approach proved far more effective than armies ever could. At the same time, the United States expanded its military presence across the world in a way no empire had ever achieved. Permanent bases were established in strategic locations, stretching from Western Europe to East Asia. American troops were stationed not as conquerors, but as protectors. Alliances replaced empires, and defense agreements replaced colonial rule. Through NATO and other military partnerships, the United States guaranteed the security of dozens of nations while quietly ensuring its own global reach. For the first time in human history, a single country maintained the ability to project military power anywhere on the planet at a moment's notice. No rival could match this scale. No adversary could ignore it. Even nations that opposed American policies were forced to acknowledge American presence. Sovereignty still existed, but it now operated under an invisible ceiling defined by U.S. power. Political influence followed quickly. Throughout the post-war era, the United States became deeply involved in shaping governments around the world. In regions destabilized by war, colonial collapse, or ideological conflict, American influence determined which leaders rose and which fell. Support was granted to those aligned with U.S. interests, while opposition was quietly undermined or openly confronted. This was not chaos or improvisation, it was calculated global management. The Cold War intensified this influence even further. The world became divided not just by borders, but by ideology. Nations were no longer simply independent states, they were pieces on a global chessboard. The United States positioned itself as the leader of the so-called free world, defining acceptable paths of development and governance. Countries were allowed to choose their futures, but only within boundaries that did not challenge American dominance. Beyond military and political power, the United States conquered something far more subtle: culture. American movies, music, fashion, and language spread across the globe at an unprecedented rate. Hollywood became the world's storyteller. American ideals of freedom, success, and individualism were broadcast into living rooms across every continent. Even in countries hostile to the United States, American culture became irresistible. Behind closed borders and strict censorship, American music was secretly listened to. American films were illegally copied and shared. American lifestyles became symbols of aspiration. This cultural influence did something no army could achieve. It reshaped desires. People did not simply fear American power, they admired it. They wanted to live it. Economic control deepened this dominance even further. After the war, the United States positioned its currency at the center of the global financial system. The dollar became the foundation of international trade, global reserves, and energy markets. Nations across the world depended on American finance to function. This gave the United States an unprecedented level of influence over global economics. Through financial institutions, loans, trade agreements, and sanctions, the United States could pressure entire economies without deploying a single soldier. Decisions made in Washington could cause markets to rise or collapse across the world. Power was no longer measured only in tanks and missiles, but in currency, debt, and access to trade. As decades passed, rivals rose and fell. The Soviet Union collapsed under the weight of its own system. Former empires faded into history. New nations emerged, but the global structure remained largely unchanged. The United States continued to operate as the central force shaping international outcomes. Conflicts, alliances, crises, and recoveries all flowed through American influence. The post-war world was not built randomly. It was engineered, it was stabilized, managed, and controlled through systems designed by the United States. This form of sovereignty did not rely on flags planted in foreign soil, but on networks of influence that reached deeper and lasted longer than any traditional empire. Today, the legacy of that post-war dominance still defines the modern world. Global institutions, military alliances, financial systems, and cultural norms all carry the imprint of American power. Whether admired or criticized, supported or resisted, the reality remains the same. After World War II, the world did not simply rebuild. It reorganized itself around a single center of gravity, the United States of America. No nation before it had shaped the global order so completely without formal conquest, and no nation since has managed to escape its influence.